The Second Crusade cannot be understood without looking back at the legacy of the First Crusade. In 1099, Crusaders captured Jerusalem and established fragile Crusader states, Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. Yet these victories planted seeds of constant conflict as the Muslim world sought to reclaim its lands. Over the following decades, internal rivalries among Crusaders, shifting alliances, and the resilience of Muslim leaders exposed the weakness of these states. The fall of Edessa in 1144 to Zengi, a powerful Muslim Atabeg, shattered the Crusaders' security and sent shockwaves across Europe. What had once seemed a divine triumph now appeared under mortal threat. It was this crisis that ignited the call for the Second Crusade. The Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, did not arise in isolation. It was deeply rooted in the legacy of the First Crusade and the precarious political-religious balance it left behind in the Levant. To understand the motivations, challenges, and eventual outcomes of the Second Crusade, one must first trace the path carved by the First Crusade and the fragile structures it established. The Crusades were not a single, continuous campaign, but a series of military and religious expeditions that unfolded over centuries, driven by faith, politics, and the competing ambitions of Christian and Muslim rulers alike. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, had been a shocking and transformative event in both Europe and the Near East. Launched at the call of Pope Urban II in 1095, it rallied thousands of knights, nobles, peasants, and adventurers from across Christendom under the banner of liberating Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim control. Against all odds, and despite immense hardship, the Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099 after a bloody siege, establishing what seemed like a miraculous Christian victory. The triumph of the Crusaders was hailed throughout Europe as proof of divine favor, inspiring a new vision of religious warfare where salvation and martial duty were intertwined. But the First Crusade's success created as many problems as it solved. The victors established 4 Latin Christian states in the east: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. These Crusader states were fragile enclaves surrounded by hostile Muslim power. Their survival depended on continued military reinforcement from the West, alliances with local powers, and constant vigilance against neighboring Islamic rulers who sought to reclaim their lands. The Crusader states were vulnerable, not only because of geography, but also because of their small European populations, and the fact that the enthusiasm of the First Crusade was difficult to replicate. From the moment of their creation, the Crusader states faced existential threats. Muslim rulers, though divided among themselves between Seljuk Turks, local emirs, and the Abbasid Caliphate, viewed the Crusaders as foreign invaders and infidels who had desecrated holy lands. At first, internal Muslim rivalries between Sunnis and Shiites or among competing dynasties prevented a coordinated response. This disunity had allowed the First Crusade to succeed. However, over the following decades, Muslim powers began consolidating and seeking to reverse the Christian gains. The County of Edessa, the northernmost Crusader state, was particularly exposed. Located deep in hostile territory and distant from Jerusalem, Edessa had few resources and relied heavily on alliances with Armenian and Byzantine neighbors. By the 1130s and 1140s, Turkish and Muslim forces were pressing harder against its borders. Meanwhile, new leaders were emerging in the Muslim world who possessed both the political skill and the religious conviction to challenge the Crusaders more effectively. Among them was Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, whose rise marked a turning point in the struggle for control of the Levant. His ambition and jihadist zeal reinvigorated Muslim resistance, transforming the conflict from scattered regional skirmishes into a more unified Islamic counter-offensive. The fall of Edessa in 1144 to Zengi was a catastrophic blow to the Crusader states and to Christendom at large. As the first of the Crusader states to be established, Edessa's collapse shocked Europe. It exposed the vulnerability of the Crusader presence in the East and symbolized the potential unraveling of the Christian project in the Holy Land. The fall also provided Muslim rulers with a powerful propaganda victory, energizing their cause and proving that the Latin states could indeed be defeated. Importance of the Second Crusade. The fall of Edessa triggered a wave of alarm and grief in Europe, sparking calls for renewed military intervention. The Second Crusade was thus born as a direct response to the loss of Edessa. Unlike the spontaneous fervor of the First Crusade, this new expedition was carefully orchestrated and officially sanctioned by Pope Eugenius III, who issued the papal bull Quantum Predecessors in 1145. The Second Crusade carried immense symbolic and strategic importance. First, it represented an effort to defend the Christian East and preserve the fragile Crusader states from total annihilation. The loss of Edessa was not just a local defeat. It threatened the entire Christian presence in the Levant, including Jerusalem itself. Without reinforcement, the Crusader states risked being overrun by increasingly unified Muslim powers. Second, the Second Crusade marked a new stage in the evolution of the crusading movement. It was the first crusade led by reigning monarchs, King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of the Holy Roman Empire, demonstrating how deeply the idea of crusading had penetrated the political culture of medieval Europe. Unlike the ragtag armies and semi-independent nobles of the First Crusade, the Second Crusade involved the full weight of royal authority, signaling a more organized and official approach to holy war. Third, the Second Crusade carried profound religious and cultural significance. Preachers like Bernard of Clairvaux cast the expedition as a sacred duty, urging Christians to take up the cross to defend their brothers and reclaim lost lands. Participation in the crusade was framed as a path to salvation, reinforcing the notion of crusading as both a spiritual and martial obligation. The campaign also highlighted the growing entanglement between Western Christendom and the politics of the Eastern Mediterranean, as Byzantine cooperation, or lack thereof, would prove crucial to the outcome. In summary, the Second Crusade was not merely another military expedition, but a pivotal moment in medieval history. It was shaped by the triumphs and frailties of the First Crusade, the precarious survival of the Crusader states, and the growing strength of Muslim resistance. Its importance lay not only in the attempt to recover Edessa, but also in its broader role as a symbol of Christian unity, royal authority, and religious fervor. Though its ultimate outcome would prove disappointing and even disastrous, the Second Crusade remains a vital chapter in understanding the ebb and flow of power, faith, and politics during the age of the Crusades. The political background. The Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, unfolded within a complex web of political, religious, and cultural tensions that stretched from Western Europe to the Levant. Understanding the political background of this crusade requires examining three interlocking spheres: the state of Christian Europe under monarchs such as Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, the papacy's role in promoting and directing the crusade, the Byzantine Empire under Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, and the shifting landscape of the Muslim world under the leadership of Zengi and his successor Nur ad-Din. Each of these contexts shaped not only the causes of the Second Crusade, but also its strategies, alliances, and eventual failures. The situation in Europe. In France, the crown was held by Louis VII, 1137 to 1180, a Capetian monarch who ascended the throne at a relatively young age. Louis VII was deeply pious, perhaps excessively so, and his religiosity influenced his political outlook. His reign was marked by a desire to assert royal authority over the French nobility and to elevate the prestige of the Capetian monarchy. However, France was still a kingdom of fragmented power. Local barons and dukes often held greater practical control than the king, especially in regions like Aquitaine, Burgundy, and Normandy. Louis's decision to participate in the Second Crusade was motivated by both religious devotion and political necessity. The fall of Edessa in 1144 shocked the Christian world, but Louis was also seeking a way to resolve domestic tensions, including strained relations with powerful nobles and with his formidable wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. The crusade offered Louis an opportunity to project himself as a Christian king defending the faith, while also enhancing his prestige across Europe. His involvement was strongly encouraged by Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian abbot whose eloquent preaching was instrumental in mobilizing support for the crusade. Conrad III of Germany. In the Holy Roman Empire, the crown rested with Conrad III, 1138 to 1152, the first king from the Hohenstaufen dynasty. His position was more precarious than Louis's, as the empire was a vast, decentralized realm with numerous princes, dukes, and bishops exercising significant autonomy. Conrad's authority was contested by the rival Welf family, particularly Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony and Bavaria, who refused to join the crusade. Nevertheless, Conrad viewed participation in the crusade as an opportunity to strengthen his legitimacy as emperor and to assert German leadership within Christendom. By taking up the cross, he could unite his nobles under a common cause and gain papal favor, particularly in light of the empire's historically fraught relations with Rome. Yet the very divisions within the empire, combined with the logistical challenges of leading a large German army eastward, would prove disastrous during the campaign. The papacy. At the heart of crusading ideology stood the papacy, which sought to present itself as the unifying force of Latin Christendom. Pope Eugenius III, 1145 to 1153, a disciple of Bernard of Clairvaux, issued the papal bull Quantum Praedecessoris in December 1135, formally calling for a crusade to recover Edessa and defend the Christian East. Eugenius's appeal built on the precedent of Pope Urban II's call at Clermont in 1095, but it also reflected the papacy's growing sense of authority as the spiritual leader of Europe. The papacy's endorsement gave the crusade its religious legitimacy. Eugenius promised participants indulgences, remission of sins for those who took up the cross, and emphasized the defense of Christendom as a holy obligation. However, the papacy also faced its own struggles, including conflicts with Roman communes and resistance from secular rulers. Its reliance on figures like Bernard of Clairvaux to preach the crusade underscored the difficulty of rallying widespread enthusiasm compared to the First Crusade. The Byzantine Empire. The Second Crusade's success depended heavily on relations with the Byzantine Empire, whose lands lay between Europe and the Holy Land. At the time, the empire was ruled by Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, 1143 to 1180, a vigorous and ambitious monarch of the Komnenian dynasty. Manuel sought to restore Byzantine prestige, which had been weakened during the 11th century by invasions from Normans, Pechenegs, and Turks. Relations with Crusaders. The memory of the First Crusade still cast a shadow over Byzantine-Latin relations. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, Manuel's grandfather, had invited Western aid in 1095 to help resist the Seljuks, but the Crusaders' conquest of Jerusalem and their establishment of independent states in the Levant created deep tensions. Byzantium had expected the Crusaders to return conquered lands to imperial control, yet instead they carved out their own principalities. This betrayal poisoned relations and fueled Byzantine suspicion of Western motives. By the time of Manuel I, these suspicions remained strong. When Louis VII and Conrad III led their armies across Byzantine territory, Manuel faced the delicate task of managing their passage without allowing them to threaten imperial stability. He feared that the Crusaders might attempt to seize Byzantine lands rather than focus on the Muslims. To counter this, Manuel demanded oaths of loyalty from the Crusader leaders and sought to maintain tight control over their movements. Despite these precautions, tensions flared. The German army, in particular, clashed with Byzantine forces and local populations, deepening mistrust. Manuel himself pursued a pragmatic policy, maintaining truces with certain Muslim rulers, such as the Seljuks, to protect his eastern frontier, even as the Crusaders demanded total war against Islam. These conflicting priorities strained the fragile alliance and hindered the coordination necessary for success in the Levant. The Muslim world. While Europe and Byzantium grappled with internal divisions, the Muslim world was undergoing a profound transformation. At the time of the First Crusade, Muslim rulers were fragmented among rival dynasties: the Seljuk Turks, the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, and numerous local emirs. This disunity had been one of the key factors enabling the Crusaders to succeed in the late 11th century. By the mid-12th century, however, a new wave of Muslim leaders was working to consolidate power and rally resistance against the Crusader states. Zengi. Foremost among these leaders was Imad al-Din Zengi, 1085 to 1146, the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo. A formidable military commander and astute politician, Zengi combined jihadist rhetoric with ruthless ambition. His capture of Edessa in 1144 was a watershed moment. It not only destroyed the First Crusader state, but also demonstrated that the Latins were not invincible. Zengi's victory was celebrated across the Muslim world as a triumph of faith and a call to unity. Zengi's rule was characterized by both brutality and pragmatism. He dealt harshly with opponents, often using fear to maintain loyalty. Yet he also pursued alliances when convenient. His campaigns against both Muslim rivals and Christian foes underscored the intertwined nature of politics and religion in the region. Nur ad-Din, following Zengi's assassination in 1146, his son, Nur ad-Din, 1118 to 1174, inherited Aleppo and carried forward his father's mission. Unlike Zengi, who was often seen as opportunistic, Nur ad-Din cultivated a reputation as a devout and just ruler, committed to the defense of Islam. He emphasized the concept of jihad, not merely as a political tool, but as a religious duty, using it to unify disparate Muslim factions under his leadership. Nur ad-Din's rise represented a turning point. He worked tirelessly to consolidate Muslim territories in Syria and to resist both the Crusader states and Byzantine encroachment. Under his guidance, the Muslim response to the Crusades became more coordinated, setting the stage for the later emergence of Saladin, who would eventually expel the Crusaders from Jerusalem. Fragmentation and unity. Despite the growing strength of leaders like Zengi and Nur ad-Din, the Muslim world was still far from fully united. Rivalries persisted between the Sunni rulers of Syria and the Shiite Fatimids in Egypt, as well as among various Turkish dynasties. Yet, compared to the late 11th century, there was a clear movement toward greater cohesion. The fall of Edessa provided both the symbol and the impetus for Muslims to rally together, a development that would profoundly alter the balance of power in the region. The call to arms, the 1145 to 1147. The Second Crusade was born from crisis. The fall of the county of Edessa in 1144 was more than the loss of a frontier stronghold. It was the collapse of the first Crusader state, the first domino to topple in the fragile Christian presence of the Levant. Its fall shocked Christendom and exposed the vulnerability of the Latin East. From this shockwave emerged a powerful call to arms, carried forward by the papacy and amplified by the most influential preacher of the age, Bernard of Clairvaux. The fall of Edessa, 1144, the spark of crisis. The county of Edessa, established during the First Crusade, was the most vulnerable and isolated of the Crusader states. Situated far to the north, cut off from the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and surrounded by hostile Muslim territories, it relied on fragile alliances with Armenians and occasional Byzantine support. Its rulers often struggled with limited manpower, internal disputes, and lack of reinforcements from the West. In 1144, its fragility was brutally exposed. Imad al-Din Zengi, Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, seized the opportunity to strike. With shrewd timing, he besieged Edessa during a period of internal weakness. Count Jocelyn II had alienated local allies and left the city poorly defended. Zengi's forces stormed Edessa in December 1144, overwhelming the Christian garrison. The fall was accompanied by massacre and enslavement, as many inhabitants, both Latin and native Christian, were killed or sold into captivity. News of Edessa's fall reverberated across the Latin East and Europe. It was the first major loss of territory since the creation of the Crusader states and a severe blow to Christian morale. To many, it appeared that the survival of the entire Crusader project was at stake. If Edessa could fall, so too might Antioch, Tripoli, and even Jerusalem itself. The urgency of this crisis demanded a response from the West. Pope Eugenius III and the papal bull Quantum Praedecessories. The first to act was Pope Eugenius III, 1145 to 1153. Newly elected and facing challenges to papal authority in Rome, Eugenius recognized that the defense of the Holy Land could both strengthen papal prestige and unite Christendom under his leadership. In December 1145, he issued the papal bull Quantum Praedecessories, the formal call for a new crusade. The bull invoked the memory of the First Crusade, urging Christians to follow the example of their illustrious predecessors who had liberated Jerusalem. It framed the loss of Edessa as a catastrophe for all of Christendom, demanding collective action. Like Urban II's earlier appeal, it promised indulgences, remission of sins for those who took the cross, as well as protections for their families and property during their absence. Importantly, Eugenius's bull demonstrated the evolution of crusading ideology. Whereas Urban II, call it Clermont, had been a dramatic public sermon, Eugenius's proclamation represented a more formal and bureaucratic mechanism of papal authority. Yet the written bull alone could not stir the masses. For that, the Pope needed a voice, someone whose reputation could inflame hearts and inspire kings. Bernard of Clairvaux, the voice of the Crusade. That voice was Bernard of Clairvaux, 1090 to 1153, the charismatic Cistercian abbot and one of the most influential churchmen of the 12th century. A reformer, theologian, and preacher, Bernard embodied the spirit of monastic piety that defined much of the era. When Eugenius entrusted him with promoting the crusade, Bernard became its chief advocate. Traveling across Europe to recruit leaders and commoners alike, Bernard's preaching was electrifying. At Vézelay in Burgundy in 1146, before a massive crowd, he delivered a sermon that moved even the skeptical King Louis VII of France to take the cross. Inspired by Bernard's words, Louis declared his intention to lead the expedition, and his queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, also took the cross. This royal commitment gave the crusade immense prestige. Bernard's influence extended beyond France. He traveled to Germany, where he persuaded Conrad III, Holy Roman Emperor, to join. The recruitment of two reigning monarchs marked a dramatic escalation from the First Crusade, which had been led by lesser nobles. Bernard also rallied thousands of knights, peasants, and clerics. His message framed the crusade not simply as a military necessity, but as a spiritual duty, promising heavenly rewards for earthly sacrifices. However, Bernard's preaching also produced darker consequences. In Germany, the crusade fervor he ignited fueled anti-Jewish violence, echoing the massacres of the First Crusade. Bernard condemned these pogroms and personally intervened to stop them. But the episodes revealed the volatile energy unleashed by crusade propaganda. Preparation and routes of the Crusaders. The departure of the Second Crusade in 1147 marked the largest mobilization of armed forces since the First Crusade, involving the full participation of the French and German monarchies. Both armies prepared separately, yet their fates were intertwined as they set out toward the Byzantine Empire and ultimately the Holy Land. Careful planning of routes, supplies, and logistics was critical, though in practice, these preparations proved inadequate against the immense challenges of distance, terrain, and hostile populations. The French and German armies. King Louis VII of France gathered his forces primarily in Burgundy, where Bernard of Clairvaux had earlier preached the crusade at Vézelay. Louis's army included a mixture of feudal knights, lesser nobles, and large numbers of non-combatants, including women and clergy. His queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, famously accompanied him, bringing along her own retinue of knights from Aquitaine. The French force was disciplined in appearance, but burdened with excess baggage and camp followers, which slowed progress. Emperor Conrad III of Germany, meanwhile, assembled a formidable army in Regensburg. His force was numerically larger than the French contingent, composed of imperial knights and contingents from across the German principalities. However, Conrad faced difficulties in unifying his fractious nobles and ensuring reliable supply lines. His army marched earlier than the French, setting the stage for hardship in Anatolia. Crossing the Byzantine Empire, both armies marched overland, choosing the traditional land route through the Byzantine Empire rather than risking sea transport. This meant passing through Hungary, the Balkans, and into imperial territory before crossing into Asia Minor. Relations with the Byzantines were tense. Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, wary of Western ambitions, sought to keep the Crusader armies under tight control. He insisted on oaths of loyalty and directed the armies along designated routes to minimize disorder. Despite these precautions, tensions flared as Crusaders clashed with local populations and Byzantine garrisons. The sheer size of the armies strained the empire's resources, forcing Manuel to balance uneasy cooperation with defensive measures. Supply lines, geography, and routes logistics posed a constant challenge. Overland marches required reliable supply lines, but feeding tens of thousands of men and horses across mountainous terrain was nearly impossible. The Crusaders relied heavily on Byzantine markets, yet shortages and disputes led to resentment. Geography compounded the problem. The rugged Balkans and the treacherous mountains of Anatolia sapped morale and strength. Maps of the routes show Conrad's Germans marching first along the Danube through Hungary and the Balkans, then into Byzantine territory at Constantinople. Louis's French army followed a similar path, departing later but converging near the capital. From there, both crossed into Asia Minor, where their hardships multiplied, especially in the arid landscapes of Anatolia, where supply lines broke down. The preparation and routes of the Crusaders reflected the ambition and scale of the Second Crusade. Yet, while the French and German armies set out with grandeur, their reliance on Byzantine cooperation, fragile supply chains, and poorly planned logistics foreshadowed the disasters that would follow in Asia Minor. The march eastward, begun in hope, quickly turned into a grueling test of endurance that weakened both armies before they ever reached the Holy Land. Campaign in Anatolia, 1147 to 1148, the most arduous stage of the Second Crusade, unfolded in Asia Minor, where the armies of Conrad III and Louis VII encountered the full force of geography, poor coordination, and the hostile maneuvering of the Seljuk Turks. The campaign in Anatolia not only decimated the Crusader armies, but also exposed the fragile alliances with Byzantium and the military resilience of the Seljuks. Conrad III's march and the Battle of Dorylaeum, 1147. Conrad's German army, numbering perhaps 20,000 to 30,000, was the first to cross the Bosporus into Anatolia. Rather than waiting for Louis VII's French force, Conrad decided to march independently through central Anatolia toward Iconium, Konya, the Seljuk capital. This was a strategic miscalculation. By advancing along the same route taken by the First Crusade in 1097, Conrad underestimated how much the balance of power had shifted in the intervening decades. At Dorylaeum in October 1147, near the site of the earlier Crusader victory, Conrad's army faced a very different outcome. The Seljuk Turks under Sultan Masud I of Rum employed classic hit-and-run tactics with mounted archers, harassing the slow-moving Germans across open terrain. The heavily armored knights and infantry could not respond effectively, and the army's extended baggage train made it even more vulnerable. After days of attrition and repeated ambushes, Conrad's forces collapsed. Thousands were killed, supplies were lost, and the once proud German host was reduced to a battered remnant retreating toward Byzantine territory. Conrad himself barely escaped with his life, eventually withdrawing to Constantinople to recover. Louis VII's march through Anatolia. King Louis VII of France, who had crossed into Asia Minor shortly after Conrad, fared little better. His army was large, but encumbered by vast numbers of non-combatants and baggage. Determined to avoid Conrad's mistakes, Louis initially kept close to the coast, hoping to take advantage of better supplies and Byzantine naval support. However, the mountainous terrain of western Anatolia, combined with the constant harassment by Seljuk forces, turned the march into an ordeal. The most severe trial came in early 1148, when Louis's forces attempted to cross the mountains near Laodicea and Anatolia. Narrow passes became death traps as the Seljuks ambushed the column and inflicted heavy casualties. The French knights, unable to maneuver in confined terrain, were picked off by Turkish archers. Starvation and thirst compounded the losses. Eventually, a portion of Louis's army was evacuated by Byzantine ships from Anatolia, but thousands of stragglers were abandoned and massacred on the march to Antioch. Byzantine Seljuk politics. The disasters in Anatolia were shaped not only by military misfortune, but also by Byzantine Seljuk politics. Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, had signed a truce with the Seljuks shortly before the Crusade, hoping to secure his eastern frontier. While this was a pragmatic move for Byzantium, it fueled Crusaders' suspicions of betrayal. Many Germans and French believed the Byzantines had deliberately left them exposed to Turkish attacks. In reality, Manuel sought to control the Crusaders' movements to protect his empire, but his cautious diplomacy limited coordinated action against the Seljuks. Meanwhile, the Seljuks exploited the opportunity, using their mobility and knowledge of the terrain to devastating effect against the lumbering Western armies. Hardships and ambushes. The Anatolian campaign revealed the severe mismatch between Western crusading armies and the realities of Asian warfare. The Crusaders were heavily armored, slow, and dependent on vulnerable supply lines. The Seljuks, by contrast, excelled in mobile warfare, ambushing stragglers, cutting off water supplies, and burning crops to starve the invaders. Rugged mountains, scorching heat by day and cold by night, and a hostile local population turned the march into a nightmare. By the time both armies staggered into the Levant in early 1148, they were shadows of their former selves. The losses in Anatolia crippled the Second Crusade before it even reached its main objective, ensuring that subsequent campaigns in Syria would be undertaken with weakened forces and low morale. The campaign in Anatolia was a catastrophic prelude to the Second Crusade's later failures. Conrad's defeat at Dorylaeum, Louis's harrowing mountain march, and the inability of Byzantium and the Crusaders to coordinate against the Seljuks demonstrated the widening gulf between Western military expectations and Eastern realities. Terrain, politics, and Turkish ambushes combined to turn the Crusaders' great advance into a costly retreat, shaping the destiny of the entire expedition. Crusader politics and tensions. The Second Crusade was not merely shaped by clashes with Muslim armies or the hardships of geography. Equally decisive were the deep political divisions within the Crusader ranks and their uneasy relations with allies and supposed partners. From the strained dealings with the Byzantine Empire to the rivalry between German and French contingents, the Crusaders' inability to present a united front undermined their chances of success even before battle was joined in the Levant. Relations with the Byzantine Emperor. At the heart of the Second Crusade's diplomatic problems was its relationship with the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, 1143 to 1180, had inherited both the legacy of cooperation and the mistrust generated by the First Crusade. Byzantium had expected to regain former imperial territories as the Crusaders advanced east. But instead, the Westerners had carved out their own independent states, leaving relations permanently strained. When Conrad III and Louis VII led their vast armies across Byzantine lands, Manuel sought to control them tightly. He demanded oaths of fealty, monitored their movements, and steered them toward predetermined routes. To the Crusaders, these measures looked like obstruction or betrayal. To Manuel, they were necessary precautions against unruly armies that could as easily plunder his empire as fight the Muslims. The situation worsened because Manuel had signed a truce with the Seljuk Turks, hoping to safeguard his frontiers. For Western Crusaders, who expected wholehearted support against Islam, this appeared as outright treachery. When Conrad's army was destroyed at Dorylaeum and Louis's suffered heavy losses in Anatolia, many blamed Byzantine duplicity rather than their own logistical errors. This suspicion poisoned relations, making future coordination almost impossible. German-French rivalry. Within the Crusader host itself, rivalry between the Germans and French further eroded unity. Conrad III and Louis VII were not equals in status. Conrad was Holy Roman Emperor, but Louis, younger and eager to assert himself, was determined not to appear subordinate. Each monarch marched separately, Conrad departing first, which deprived the Crusaders of the numerical advantage they might have enjoyed had they combined their forces from the start. When Conrad's army collapsed in Anatolia, Louis's French forces became the stronger of the two. Though Conrad later joined Louis in the Levant, the shift in balance created subtle tensions. The Germans, weakened and resentful, often mistrusted French leadership. The French, meanwhile, viewed the Germans as a liability after their disastrous performance in Asia Minor. This rivalry sapped cohesion at precisely the moment when unity was most essential. Coordination failures. The Second Crusade's political divisions culminated in chronic coordination failures. The lack of a single supreme commander meant that decisions were often made piecemeal, with French and German leaders acting independently. Byzantium, mistrusted by both, was sidelined rather than integrated into a common strategy. Even after reaching the Levant in 1148, these divisions persisted. At the Council of Acre, where Crusader leaders debated their next move, the failure to agree on a coherent strategy reflected the competing priorities of French, German, and local Crusader rulers. Instead of launching a united campaign to recover Edessa or strike at Aleppo, the Crusaders targeted Damascus, a decision born more of political compromise than sound strategy. Siege of Damascus, 1148. The climax of the Second Crusade came not in Edessa, whose fall had triggered the expedition, but at Damascus, one of the most important Muslim cities in Syria. The decision to besiege Damascus in July 1148 proved catastrophic. What was intended as a bold strike to strengthen the Crusader states instead exposed the deep flaws in Crusader leadership, the dangers of political intrigue, and the resilience of Muslim unity. Strategic importance of Damascus. Damascus was not only a wealthy and populous city, but also a vital strategic hub. Lying at the crossroads of trade and pilgrimage routes between Mesopotamia, Arabia, and the Levant, it commanded the approach to Jerusalem. For the Crusaders, capturing Damascus would have provided a powerful buffer state against the rising threat of Nur ad-Din, son of Zengi, who sought to unify Muslim Syria under his leadership. However, Damascus was also a politically complex target. Unlike Aleppo or Mosul, which were firmly Zengid strongholds, Damascus had at times been an uneasy ally of the Crusader states, cooperating with them against common enemies. Attacking such a city carried risks, but in 1148, the Crusaders saw it as a prize too valuable to ignore. Arrival of Crusader forces in the Levant. By the spring of 1148, both Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany had arrived in the Holy Land with the remnants of their armies. King Baldwin III of Jerusalem and his mother, Queen Melisende, joined them in council at Acre. Local Crusader rulers from Antioch and Tripoli also took part in these deliberations. The expectation in Europe had been that the Crusade would attempt to retake Edessa, the city whose fall had sparked the movement. But Edessa's defenses had already been dismantled by the Muslims, making its recovery unlikely. Instead, the leaders turned their attention to Damascus. Their choice was shaped by political calculation. Baldwin III and the Kingdom of Jerusalem feared the city might fall permanently under Zengid influence, while Louis and Conrad hoped for a dramatic victory that would restore the prestige of their failing crusade. Political intrigue among Crusader states. The decision to attack Damascus revealed the political rivalries that plagued the Crusader movement. The rulers of Antioch and Tripoli favored different strategies, with some preferring campaigns in northern Syria against Aleppo. Yet Baldwin of Jerusalem insisted on Damascus, motivated by both fear of Muslim consolidation and the desire to expand his own realm. Underlying these debates was also mistrust between the newly arrived Western monarchs and the resident barons of the Crusader states. The local lords knew the risks of attacking Damascus, given its strong defenses and history of shifting alliances. But they were overruled by the prestige of the French and German kings. This disconnect between local knowledge and foreign ambition would prove fatal. The failed siege, tactics, battles, and betrayal. The crusading host, numbering perhaps 50,000 men, advanced on Damascus in late July 1148. Initially, they attacked from the western orchards, where gardens and irrigation channels provided both cover and sustenance. The defenders, however, were well prepared. The Atabeg of Damascus, Mu'in ad-Din Unur, rallied the population, calling on all Muslims, men, women, even children, to defend the city. For 3 days, the Crusaders fought bitterly through orchards and narrow lanes, suffering ambushes and harassment from archers. The defenders used the terrain skillfully, launching counterattacks from fortified towers and canal embankments. On the 4th day, fearing encirclement as reinforcements from Nur ad-Din approached, the Crusaders shifted their attack to the more open eastern walls of Damascus. This move was disastrous. The eastern side of the city was heavily fortified, with fewer orchards and less water. Crusader morale collapsed as supplies dwindled, casualties mounted, and rumors spread of betrayal. Some sources accuse certain local barons of deliberately undermining the siege, unwilling to see Damascus fall under the control of rival Crusader factions. After just 4 days, the Crusader leaders ordered a retreat. The withdrawal turned into humiliation as the great armies of France, Germany, and Jerusalem limped back to Acre without having breached the walls. The failure at Damascus shattered the Second Crusade. Militarily, it revealed the poor planning and lack of coordination that had dogged the expedition since its beginning. Politically, it alienated the Crusaders from potential allies. Damascus, once occasionally aligned with Jerusalem, now turned decisively toward Nur ad-Din for protection. The Crusaders had not only failed to expand their territory, but had also strengthened their enemies by driving Muslim Syria closer to unity. For Louis VII and Conrad III, the retreat marked a humiliating end to their expedition. Both kings soon returned to Europe, their reputations diminished. For the papacy, which had proclaimed the crusade as a divinely sanctioned mission, the disaster was a severe blow to its spiritual prestige. In the end, the siege of Damascus symbolized the collapse of the Second Crusade itself. What began with high hopes of restoring Christian dominance in the East ended in political division, strategic blunders, and a crushing defeat that emboldened Muslim resistance. Aftermath, 1149 onwards. The collapse of the Second Crusade in 1148 sent shockwaves across Christendom and reshaped the balance of power in the Levant for decades to come. What had begun with soaring expectations of restoring Christian dominance ended in bitter disillusionment, leaving behind political, religious, and military consequences that echoed well into the future. Political consequences in Europe. For Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, the failed crusade was a profound embarrassment. Both had invested immense resources and prestige in the campaign, only to return home empty-handed. Louis's failure weakened his monarchy at a time when the Capetian kings were still consolidating authority in France. Conrad, though respected as emperor, saw his authority diminished among German princes who questioned the value of imperial leadership abroad. The papacy, too, suffered. Pope Eugenius III had issued the bull Quantum Predecessore and placed the full spiritual weight of the Church behind the crusade. Its failure undermined papal credibility and contributed to growing skepticism about whether crusades were truly divinely ordained missions or politically driven gambles. Strengthening of Muslim states under Nur ad-Din. If Europe reeled from disappointment, the Muslim world emerged stronger and more united. In the aftermath of the failed siege of Damascus, the city allied itself firmly with Nur ad-Din, the powerful ruler of Aleppo and son of Zengi. This was a decisive moment in the consolidation of Muslim Syria. Nur ad-Din used the opportunity to portray himself as the defender of Islam against foreign invaders. His growing prestige laid the groundwork for future unity in the region, ultimately leading to the rise of Saladin, who would consolidate Egypt and Syria and later challenge the Crusaders during the Third Crusade. The failure of the Second Crusade thus accelerated the process of Muslim political and military consolidation. Weakening of Crusader prestige. For the Crusader states, the debacle was disastrous. Not only had they failed to expand their territories, but their attempted conquest of Damascus alienated a city that had once been a useful, if reluctant, ally. Instead of strengthening their position, the Crusaders created a more dangerous foe, with Damascus now aligned against them. More broadly, the aura of Crusader invincibility, created by the First Crusade's stunning victories, was shattered. Muslim leaders realized that with unity and careful strategy, the Crusaders could be defeated. Maps and geographic analysis. The Second Crusade cannot be understood without attention to geography, since terrain, routes, and political borders shaped both strategy and outcome. The movement of armies, the locations of battles, and the fragile geography of the Crusader states all played decisive roles in the eventual collapse of the Crusade. Routes of German and French armies. The Crusade was launched simultaneously by the two great powers of Western Europe, the Holy Roman Empire under Conrad III and the Kingdom of France under Louis VII. Both armies marched overland toward the Levant, traversing the Byzantine Empire before crossing into Anatolia. Conrad's Germans left first, marching through Hungary and the Balkans into Byzantine territory. From Constantinople, they crossed into Asia Minor, following the old Roman military road toward Dorylaeum. The route was direct but treacherous, cutting through mountainous regions with limited supplies. Louis VII's French army followed a similar path but lagged behind. By the time they crossed Anatolia, the Germans had already been devastated by Seljuk ambushes, forcing Louis to adapt his march. His forces endured brutal mountain terrain and constant skirmishes, losing thousands before reaching Antioch and then Jerusalem. The overlapping yet staggered routes highlight both the immense logistical strain and the absence of unified planning between the two monarchs. Battle sites: Anatolia and Damascus. The geography of Anatolia was one of the Crusade's greatest obstacles. The Battle of Dorylaeum, 1147, fought near the central Anatolian plateau, exposed the vulnerability of large, slow-moving European armies against nimble Seljuk cavalry. The barren terrain and scorching climate deprived Crusaders of water and food, weakening them before battle even began. In contrast, the Siege of Damascus, 1148, unfolded in a vastly different landscape. Damascus was surrounded by rich orchards irrigated by the Barada River, creating a maze of gardens that favored defenders. Initially, the Crusaders attacked from the west, where supplies and cover were abundant. But when they shifted eastward, they found open, arid ground with strong fortifications, a disastrous choice that doomed the siege. Crusader states' geography and borders. The Crusader states, Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli, and the remnants of Edessa, were fragile enclaves surrounded by hostile or unstable Muslim territories. Their survival depended on holding narrow coastal plains and key fortresses that linked them together. Geographically, the states were stretched thin, separated by deserts and mountains, and reliant on maritime supply lines from Europe. This precarious geography left them highly vulnerable to a unified Muslim Syria. With Edessa lost in 1144 and Damascus alienated after 1140, conclusion, the Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, stands as one of the most striking failures of the medieval crusading movement. Despite vast resources, royal leadership, and papal blessing, the expedition collapsed because of poor coordination, deep political divisions, and disastrous strategic decisions. The armies of Conrad III and Louis VII were decimated in Anatolia by harsh terrain and Seljuk ambushes, while their uneasy alliance with Byzantium further fractured under suspicion. The climactic siege of Damascus, meant to be a bold stroke to secure the Crusader states, instead ended in humiliation after just 4 days. Instead of regaining lost ground, the Crusaders alienated Damascus and drove it into the arms of their greatest rival, Nur ad-Din. The failure carried profound political and military consequences. In Europe, monarchs and the papacy alike suffered reputational damage, as the aura of divine favor surrounding the Crusades was shaken. The local Crusader lords, who had warned against attacking Damascus, lost faith in Western reinforcements, while the Muslims gained confidence that the once invincible Crusaders could be defeated. Strategically, the Crusader states emerged weaker and more isolated, their fragile geography now hemmed in by a more unified Muslim front. Most importantly, the Second Crusade marked a turning point in the balance of power. By cementing Damascus under Nur ad-Din's influence, it accelerated the unification of Syria. This growing strength would later pass to Saladin, who combined Egypt and Syria into a formidable empire, ultimately recapturing Jerusalem in 1187. The failure of the Second Crusade thus set the stage for the far more dramatic confrontation of the Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa. In the end, the Second Crusade is remembered less for its battles than for its lessons. Disunity, poor strategy, and mistrust could doom even the mightiest armies. Don't forget to subscribe for more epic history journeys. Stay tuned as we march into the Third Crusade, where Saladin and Richard the Lionheart clash.